The original Game Boy just turned 35 years old, and wow, what an amazing handheld this device would turn out to become. What makes a good gaming platform are the games, and the Game Boy did not disappoint. The system would come bundled with Tetris as the pack-in game, the simple puzzle game with falling blocks that captivated millions of players around the world who were addicted to it, and all of a sudden the Nintendo Game Boy was the coolest handheld to have. The hardware and the games are legendary, but some of the games really did punch above their weight. In both the visual and audio categories, there was truly some amazing programming on display here, and the system ran on 4 conventional AA batteries. And because of its low spec and low power design, you could last up to 30 hours on a single charge. Not only this, the Game Boy would popularize cartridge-based handhelds. It would also introduce franchises such as Pokemon and Kirby. And on the tech side, the Game Boy hardware was very basic. A 160 by 144 dot matrix display is only capable of 4-color output. The 4.19 MHz sharp processor is based on the Zilog Z80 instruction set. There's 8 kilobytes of work RAM and 8 kilobytes of display RAM, with a 256-byte boot ROM program that's executed every single time the system is powered on. On the audio side, there are 4 separate audio channels, 2 for pulse audio, 1 wave channel, and 1 noise channel. There's only 1 speaker on the Game Boy, which means output is in mono. However, the Game Boy itself is fully capable of stereo audio. Just plug in a pair of headphones into the headphone jack and you can hear it in its proper stereo glory. It's also very easy to write off the Game Boy audio as simplistic, but in the right hands, it was capable of the incredible. Now, when it came to making games on the Game Boy, developers initially would reduce scope in what they felt was achievable on the device as compared to what they could do on the NES, for example. And in that regard, we never got a port of, say, Super Mario Bros., but we did see Super Mario Land, which in turn only contains a small amount of levels as compared to the NES game. And these limitations were due to developers getting to terms with the hardware, but it wouldn't take long before they gained experience with the Game Boy and started to expand their scope, building out bigger, more ambitious games that were larger, with graphical and audio enhancements. Though still limited by its 4 colors, could start to rival what was being done on the NES, and in some instances even better. In the case of Super Mario Land, it's a small game with only 12 levels, and that's because the entire contents of the game fits neatly into the 32 kilobytes of ROM space without any bank switching. Early games were small, but the Game Boy could be expanded with MBC or Game Boy Mapper chips to greatly expand the size of the game. This meant that larger games in size and scope could be developed. The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening is one such game that really pushed what the Game Boy could do, not because of anything technically, but because of its scope. The game sits right next to Link to the Past on the SNES as one of the best 2D Zeldas. The game itself clocks in at about 15 hours of playtime. The developers pack so much charm and personality into one game, and it's a true high point for not only the Game Boy, but for the Legend of Zelda franchise. And slowly over time, developers realized they could bring ports to the hardware that, while obviously had limitations in terms of graphics and sound, could sit side by side next to its big brother on the NES or Super NES and hold its own. When we think about Factor 5, most of us think about Rogue Squadron or maybe Turrican on the Amiga, but Factor 5 was also the masters of the Game Boy. Contra 3 The Alien Wars has to be one of the most ambitious ports of all time. No one wakes up and says, right, today I'm going to port Contra 3 to the Game Boy with no limits. But Factor 5 did it. A faithful version of the Super Nintendo game, while of course didn't have the Mode 7 or the color, it does have the levels, the sprites, the controls, and the action was perfectly executed. And this is just me, but I prefer the overhead levels on the Game Boy over the Mode 7 rotation of the Super NES version. Contra 3 is a very, very impressive port, and it's definitely something that you should check out if you're a fan of the Game Boy. But what about games that started to punch above their weight in terms of what could be achieved on the Game Boy hardware itself? Well, before we talk about that, let's have a quick primer on how the Game Boy renders its graphics. Now, the Game Boy has 3 separate graphics layers that can be rendered individually: the background layer, the sprite layer, and the window or fix layer. But one of the coolest games that I've ever played on the Game Boy is the Japanese shooter Chikyu Keihu Gansas, which has 2 layers of background scrolling. Now, how might you ask, is this even possible? Well, simply put, The effect works because it's drawing two separate backgrounds very quickly and alternating them every other frame. And because of the inherent motion blur that's found on the DMG display, this effect looks fantastic, giving the appearance of two separate background layers. But it also gives off the impression that there are more colors on the Game Boy than there should be. And this is one of those games that some emulators have a lot of trouble with. Precise timing is absolutely essential for this game to be emulated correctly. But if you do want to get the authentic experience, nothing beats the original dot matrix display. Now I should mention here that the Game Boy has no concept of a frame buffer. Everything is rendered using tiles or 8x8 blocks of pixels on the Game Boy, so if you want to draw the entire contents of the 160x144 display, you effectively have to draw 20 tiles across by 18 tiles down. Now the Game Boy offers the developer the ability to horizontally scroll these tiles for very smooth scrolling. But even cooler is that mid-frame for any given scan line, you can call an interrupt to adjust the scroll of that scan line independently. This meant that really cool demo-style scrolling effects would be possible, including effects such as parallax scrolling. One really cool use case for this was in racing games. Because of the mid-frame scanline manipulation that was possible, a racetrack could easily be created to simulate corners and bends by individually adjusting the horizontal scanline scroll rate mid-frame. And this is evident in a game such as V-Rally, one of the most technically impressive racing games on the Game Boy original. The track zooms towards you at a fluid speed, with turns and even hills later in the game. But if you take a close look at what's going on behind the scenes, there is simply a block of tiles that represents a static racetrack. This track is being manipulated by the Game Boy hardware to simulate the road, and the effect is excellent. Furthermore, the game really gives you the feeling that it's a super scale game without any type of pre-calculated sprites. But looking closer, all these roadside sprites are indeed being pre-calculated. V-Rally is simply stunning, and somehow everything is running on a lowly 4.19 MHz Z80. This is incredible stuff. One of the more impressive shoot-em-ups on the Game Boy has to be Sagaia, which is a port of Darius 2 from the Sega Genesis. And if you know your Darius games, you know that this shoot-em-up series pits you against these large cybernetic sea creatures with a large mechanical boss like a fish or an octopus at the end of each level. Now check out this Game Boy version. As you can see, it has fully detailed backgrounds and parallax scrolling, and it also has those large mechanical bosses. This alone is an incredible technical achievement. There's also a large playfield that is larger than the actual viewport, which means that the game not only scrolls horizontally with the gameplay, but also allows the player to scroll the playfield up and down slightly, offering more chances to evade enemy patterns and bullets. Sagaia is an amazing accomplishment for the Game Boy, and it deserves its place as one of the very best shoot-em-ups on the hardware, no question. Now, when we think about the Game Boy, we think of 2D games, but the Game Boy could also render some primitive 3D graphics, and there are some notable examples of this. The first one is Faceball 2000, which originally released in 1991, 1 year I might add before Wolfenstein 3D on the PC. The game was notable for being a very early FPS, all condensed down to run on the Game Boy hardware, and it even supports up to 16 players via multiplayer link cables. Race Driving is another example of a 3D racing game that is a port from the arcade. At a glance, the game doesn't appear to be anything special, and you could certainly argue that the gameplay may not have translated well over to the portable system, but you can't argue the technical achievements that's being done here. Race Driving runs much better than what I've seen on the other 8-bit ports. It even runs better than the SNES version, which in my opinion is a slideshow most of the time. And of course, we have to talk about X, developed by Dylan Cuthbert, that featured impressive 3D environments with wireframe graphics. Now, all three of these games haven't aged well, but let's be clear. We said that the Game Boy can only render tiles, so the concept of drawing 3D vectors and lines means that rather than just drawing lines on the screen, everything must be done using tile maps once again, and this can get very, very complicated. It also means performance can suffer because new tiles have to be generated dynamically and then swapped in very, very quickly. Any player movement meant that the 3D perspective would also be updated, and these tiles would need to be updated with new geometry. If you think about it in these terms, and if you take a look at the example here of X running with the tile editor here on the right hand side, you start to make sense of how technically impressive these games actually are. We can't talk about technical accomplishments on the Game Boy without talking about Rare. Best known for their work obviously on the Nintendo 64. Rare was also very skilled on the Game Boy, and my favourite, Donkey Kong Land 3, being the pick of the games. Donkey Kong Land is based on the Donkey Kong Country series on the Super NES, but the Game Boy games aren't ports. But what they do is essentially capture the essence of the Super NES Donkey Kong Country games with large, extremely well animated sprites, fluid animations, and of course a killer soundtrack. Even with the limited color palette and screen real estate, it feels right at home as a DKC title, and that in of itself is an amazing achievement. I absolutely love Donkey Kong Land 3, and you should check it out and see what it has to offer if you haven't already. Killer Instinct is another game that gets a notable mention from me, another Rare title as well, featuring 8 out of 10 playable characters, most of the stages, top tier music, and even with just 2 buttons, it's still very easy to pull off combos, and the gameplay is fluid and you never feel like you're fighting with the controls. This is an underrated port thanks to the Game Boy's limited color palette, and it was never really in the conversation as a good arcade port. But Killer Instinct on the Game Boy, let me tell you, is incredible even given its paltry limits of the Game Boy hardware. But it's not only about the graphics, there are some incredible accomplishments with audio design. Most games didn't really take advantage of the audio hardware on the Game Boy with simplistic sound effects, but there are definitely some games with some amazing quality soundtracks. Listen, I can talk about the Game Boy for another 2 hours, and I think you guys really start to get the point here. The Game Boy is an incredible system, low power, low spec, and yet developers were able to extract the very best from the system. And one of the great things about the Game Boy is that the community has never died. In fact, it's one of the easiest places to learn how to write code and build games on. We've got development tools like the GB Studio, a very great tool that allows you to pick up and play and learn how to develop games on the Game Boy with ease. There's also the GDBK, which is a little more advanced if you know how to code in C. But essentially, both of these things can allow you to build Game Boy games, and high quality games that I might add that a lot of the members of the community are starting to build now, and we've got some really amazing things that I've seen on places like itch.io. Building your own Game Boy games is very rewarding and very fulfilling, and it's definitely something that a lot of people have embraced. There's also the emulation community, there's the FPGA community. The Game Boy really does have a lot going on right now. There's the community mods, there's also the GB Interceptor, a really useful capture device tool that I covered on the channel about 1.5 years ago, which I might add has seen significant enhancements and improvements over time. There's also an amazing overclocking and underclocking mod that I've seen, which allows you to overclock or underclock the Game Boy's processor. Now, you might be wondering, well, what is the point of this? Well, it's useful when it comes to music creation. When we talk about things like pitch shifting and things like that, it allows you to add another dimension to audio rendering on the Game Boy. So this is really cool as well. And these are just some things that I've seen. There are a lot of people that are involved in the Game Boy community in 2024. And even if you aren't, you can play some original Game Boy games via the NSO service on the Nintendo Switch Online. Now, I think that Nintendo really needs to step it up and offer more original DMG games on the NSO service, and this is hopefully something that they will do. But I do think that if you are someone that does want to revisit Nintendo history with portable systems, the original portable system, then check out the Game Boy. Getting an emulator and some ROMs isn't really something that is very complicated to do these days, and in many ways, emulation of Game Boy is really the de facto standard in 2024. But we are going to leave it here for today's episode, guys. Let me know your favorite Game Boy, original DMG Game Boy games in the comments below, or any ones that had some technical or impressive things that happened from a technical aspect that really kind of stuck with you all these years. There's probably quite a few more that I haven't covered on the channel, so let me know what they are in the comments below. We're going to leave it here for today's episode, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, please don't forget to leave me a thumbs up, and I'll catch you guys in the next episode. Bye for now.